In our January issue, which is about Youth Culture 101, we've got Andrew writing an article about how young people search for a sense of identity in like a digital era. What the heck were you trying to talk about there? Because I've read the darn article.
You've read it and you have no idea what I'm trying to say. Yeah, well, it actually connects with a book that will be out in March, which is the shameless plug for, which is more of a broad book about the church in general. And the book's called The Promise of Despair, and it will be out with Abingdon. It's called The Promise of Despair, The Way of the Cross is the Way of the Church.
Wow.
And so in that book, I try to look at ways that culturally despair still exists within our context. And one of those is to talk about how much more difficult culturally it is to formulate an identity. And because of both our globalized world and how that becomes digified and how digital we are, it becomes really difficult to answer the question, who am I? And one of the reasons it's so hard to formulate the question, who am I, is because the question, who says, or the question of authority has been thrown up in the air. So in that little article that I wrote for you guys, I try to explore how young people are trying to figure out this question, who am I, in a world where authority has become really liquefied. And in many ways, not just authority, but also community and things like that have become very liquefied. And what does that mean? Who am I in the midst of a world where questions like who says and who am I are always left radically open?
Do you have a brief thought about despair? Like, how does a young person today experience despair? Because I'm not sure a lot of people would say that's what young kids are experiencing.
Right.
Where do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's often a conversation is when we talk about despair, we tend to think of kids who are living in poverty or kids who are living in inner city neighborhoods that are very violent. And I agree that you can't minimize those realities of despair. And a kid living in a suburb where their parents are making $100,000 or even more than that a year, to equate those two things is unfair. However, I think what we often do to young people is we do a disservice to them and assume that the only people that ever have deep questions or only people who are coming up against despair are people, that those kids that maybe are in middle class situations don't have those questions. And that I think all young people and all people have to struggle with this question, what is a lifetime and why do I live it? And even young people that are living in suburban neighborhoods have the despair of trying to figure out who they are and where they belong, as well as having real people let them down. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of millions maybe even of young people who have deep questions that exist and are wrapped around their being, and people who have let them down, like parents that have divorced and ways that they've been hurt. So I don't want to minimize that experience in young people. And I tend to think that we do a disservice to young people when we assume that they don't have these big questions, and that nothingness and impossibility isn't somewhere existing within their own questions. And that's not to minimize or say that struggling for your next meal is the same thing, but it is to say that there's a similar tune that's played of despair that has these questions, what is a lifetime and why do I live it? So yeah.
So ladies and gentlemen, that was not Jean-Paul Sartre, that was Andrew Root, a famous writer, youth ministry professor guy, and so thanks for joining us, coming by and talking.
Thanks for letting me depress you.